All right, now we're running. So sorry about this. This is embarrassing. I swear I've been having greater and greater technical difficulties for the last several weeks, and I'm not really sure why. Um, I'll figure it out, hopefully. Not in time for next week because I will not be able to be doing this next week. I'm not going to be around. Um, Actually, next 2 weeks, really. Um, I might be able to get one of my streams done in the beginning of the week, but I don't know. In any case, so some Scandinavian fairy tales. So that is a reasonably accurate depiction of the cover that I'm looking at. It's a little lower res than I would have liked, but sun damage and all. Of the copy of the book I'm working with, which is copyrighted when old, 62, 1962. Um, it's nominally by a guy named Giordano Pitt. Um, it's translated by Leon King, and there are illustrations by Federico Santin. I unfortunately do not have a digital copy of the book to show you the illustrations. Suffice it to say, however, they are breathtaking. They are very pretty. Um, I'd love to do more books with illustrations, but it is increasingly difficult some of the a lot of the ones that I want to do that have illustrations, short me like attaching a GoPro to my head. Um, would be rather difficult to accomplish. I'm pretty sure I'll be able to find ones for Dinotopia because I'd love to read that aloud. Dinotopia is just like a visual feast. Absolutely gorgeous. Most comic books I'll have no problem doing, at least the ones that I think are worth reading aloud for this. Um, what I've been having real difficulty with is finding an ebook or digital publication of a Babar 50th anniversary book that I have. If anybody can shoot me a line on that, please. Uh, I don't mind spending money on it to make it happen. So this week, we are doing a couple fairy tales from this book of Scandinavian fairy tales, starting with Olaf and the King of the Elves, as well as the story that comes after it, which is Harald of Trondheim, which and Harald of Trondheim is uh, it is metal. Like this is Harald of Trondheim is pretty much everything you expect from Scandinavian fairy tales. Um, and it has like an absolutely spectacular two page illustration spread in it that just absolutely nails it. I may be able to do the third one along, which is kind of a journey story. There's also the Song of Egil I'd like to get to, but I don't know if I'll be able to. Today anyway, but there's always next time. So we'll start and we'll basically keep reading them until I'm out of time, uh, and then probably pick up where we left off. The usual. People have seen these before. Um, but yeah, as I intimated before, I won't be here next week, but or the week after. But after that, should be business as usual. That's the hope. We'll see. All right, give me one sec here to get a little swig of water, and then we'll get kicking. Olaf and the King of the Elves. Once upon a time in Norway there lived a little boy named Olaf. His father was the Lord of Flakstad, a beautiful place near a stupendous fjord, with green fields and emerald waters tinged milky white from the frothy rivers running to the sea. Early one morning, while everyone was asleep, Olaf jumped out of bed and ran to the fjord to watch the sun rise. The clear, crisp air was filled with the cries of seagulls darting here and there among the steep, jagged cliffs where they made their nests. Far below, where the sea skirted the shore, great waves rolling up against the rocks broke into spray, spreading a veil of thin, tingling mist over land and water. Olaf had never seen the fjord more beautiful. As the sun slowly rose in the pearl-gray sky, streams of pale gold light gradually swept across the shimmering water. Gulls flew here and there, squawking as they hovered over their nests, and baby birds screeched impatiently for their breakfast, filling the quiet dawn with a medley of sharp, quivering sounds. Olaf stood there spellbound on the high cliff, gazing out at the sea and remembering the wonderful stories his father had told him as they sat around the glowing fireplace in their huge, warm kitchen during the long winter evenings. Suddenly, an enormous dark shadow passed swiftly overhead. Looking up, Olaf saw a great black bird sweep by a steep cliff not far away. With its fearful eyes flaming, the bird spiraled around in a narrowing circle for a moment, and then suddenly swooped down to the top of a rock. Olaf felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He sensed that something terrible was about to happen to the peaceful colony of seagulls. A second later, the hideous bird spread its wings, with its terrible beak thrust out, slowly glided down to a small cliff below. Instantly a swarm of seagulls swooped down, flapping their wings furiously and pecking at the intruder until it zoomed away. Soaring up to the rock above, the great black bird perched there and glared down at the nest it had almost destroyed. It was protected now by a cloud of screaming seagulls whirling around the nest in a circle. But the voracious black bird had no intention of being deprived of its breakfast of eggs and tender baby birds. Spreading its wings once more, the huge bird swept down, breaking through the cordon of seagulls. Great fluttering clouds of other gulls flew to their rescue, and a terrible battle began. Soon the calm morning air was shattered with the shrill cries of the winged warriors. Feathers flew everywhere, and the sides of the cliffs were littered with wounded birds and spattered with blood. Thrilled and frightened, Olaf stood motionless on the cliff, watching the violent battle in the sky. He could see that it was not going to be easy for the seagulls to win. Impulsively, he stooped down and, picking up a handful of stones, began shouting at the top of his lungs as he threw them. There was a loud din of wildly shrieking birds and fluttering wings as the stones sped through the air towards the black bird. But they didn't seem to harm the monstrous creature any more than heavy raindrops. Olaf stooped again and picked up more stones. He threw them as hard as he could, one after another, until a large rock, heavier than the others, struck the great black bird in the head. Stunned, the hideous creature reeled, feebly flapped its wings for a moment, and then it plummeted down the side of the cliff into the roaring sea. As Olaf stood and watched the waves toss the monstrous black bird among the rocks, he almost forgot about the seagulls. Only when he heard a great fluttering of wings in the sky right above him did he look up. With their shining beaks gleaming in the sun and their snow-white wings flickering in the pale blue sky, the seagulls had formed a great flying wreath over his head to thank him for coming to their rescue. Olaf was so excited that he began jumping up and down and waving his arms with joy. Skipping and hopping, he ran along the bank of the fjord, shouting with delight, his eyes staring up at the seagulls, who were making great loops and curves in the air, as though they were dancing. Without realizing it, he ran right to the edge of the cliff. Suddenly he slipped, falling through the air amid a flutter of wings which clouded the sky. For a split second he could see the water below getting closer and closer. Then, as the billowing sea roared louder and louder in his ears, he shut his eyes while his body plunged towards the chilly waters. When Olaf opened his eyes again, he thought he was in paradise, but it was a paradise completely different from any he could have ever imagined. He blinked and rubbed his eyes to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Then he looked around him, dazed by what he saw. He was in a cavern, huge and wonderful beyond belief, gleaming with radiance like the inside of a pearl. Shimmering light, broken into thousands of reflections, surrounded him like a great hollow diamond. Stalagmites rose from the floor, stalactites hung from the ceiling like a shining candelabra. Precious stones such as agate and beryl, malachite and turquoise and quartz gave forth a translucent glimmering from the walls of the cavern. Amazed and almost frightened by such splendor, Olaf arose from where he lay, and found that he had been resting on a bed covered with a cloth of precious gold. He picked it up to look at it, and it caught his breath at its beauty. Suddenly he realized that he did not know where he was, nor what had happened to him. Was he alone amid all this splendor and its terrifying silence? He began to cry out loud as he could, but it was no use. His cries echoed and re-echoed through the immense cavern, and came back to him broken into millions of crystalline sounds that grew gradually fainter and died away. I must have fallen into the sea, Olaf thought to himself. But then why didn't I drown? Where is the water? As he looked around, dazed and afraid, a sign of hope caught his eye. He saw a bright stream of golden light streaming in at the far end of the cave, behind the dazzling columns glittering around him. When he ran over to it, he found a deep curve in the wall with a natural opening extending out over the sea like a balcony. How did I get here if I fell into the water from the top of the cliff? The boy wondered. He turned to go back to the middle of the room, and to his great surprise saw a strange creature sitting on the bed, staring at him. What could it be? It had huge butterfly wings, and great bulging eyes like a dragonfly. So frightened was Olaf that he instantly began looking around for a place to hide. "Olaf!" called the strange creature, as the boy was about to dart behind a large stalagmite. "How can you be afraid of me when every day you wish I would appear? I am one of the elves of the fjord, and, as you know, elves befriend little boys and help them out when they are in trouble." "But how was I to know that you were an elf? I have never seen one before," Olaf protested shyly. "And what did you imagine an elf would look like?" "I always thought that elves were like dwarfs, and that they had long white beards and wore red suits." "Does that mean you are disappointed with me?" "Oh, no!" the boy answered hurriedly. "I like you very much." "Good," replied the elf. "Now come with me. Our king is waiting to see you." The elf spread his huge, shining wings and flew to the back of the cave. Olaf followed him through a long, dark passageway to a great glittering room, larger and more dazzling than the first. It was crowded with elves, both large and small, as radiant as the northern lights. They were gathered around a sparkling crystal throne. Seated on the glistening throne was the King of the Elves, a superb creature larger and more lustrous than the others. So amazed was Olaf at the sight of the majestic figure with the huge, many-colored wings shining like a rainbow, that he just stood before the throne speechless with admiration. The King of the Elves was the first to speak. "Olaf," he said, looking down at the boy, "do not be surprised to find yourself in a kingdom which man is seldom permitted to enter. You performed a good and generous deed this morning when you saved a nest of seagulls from a wicked bird of prey. But for that alone I would never have had you brought here as my guest. My elves saved you from falling into the sea, because your good deed nearly cost you your life." Olaf was spellbound. He looked around unbelievingly at the crowd of brilliant, fanciful creatures, as though they were all part of an enchanting dreamland. Finally, he found the courage to murmur, "I would like to go home." "I am glad to hear that," replied the King of the Elves. "A good boy always thinks of home." He clapped his hands, and immediately a large elf as blue as a forget-me-not flew over with a small chest. The king opened it and took out a smooth, shining stone, which glowed in the brightness of the room like a brilliant moonbeam. "This is the stone you threw at the black bird," he said, handing it to Olaf. "Because of your good intentions and your bravery, it has turned into a beautiful diamond. Take it as a reward for your good deed, and think of it whenever you are called upon to be brave and kind." He clapped his hands again, and a door opened at the back of the room. When Olaf went over to it and saw that it opened onto the precipice, he stopped in amazement. But the two elves took him gently by the arms and soared away with him into the bright blue air. A second later, Olaf was on top of the cliff from which he had fallen, and looking down he could see the two elves gliding in a swift, steady curve back to the cave. As they flew in, the door closed behind them, and all trace of it vanished. Olaf never told the story of his adventure to anyone when he returned home. He hid the sparkling diamond in his garden, and, whenever he could, he ran back to the cliff from which he had fallen. He would stand there for hours and hours, peering down into the deep ravine, hoping to see at least one of the marvelous elves once more, but he never saw any of them again. For a long time he vainly tried to find his way back to the dazzling palace of the King of the Elves. Then, when he finally realized that he would never find it again, he would take the sparkling stone out of its hiding place in the garden and stare at it for hours on end, dreaming of the magic moment he had spent in the kingdom of the elves. One day, many years later, when Olaf had grown to be a youth, he noticed that the stone was gradually losing its brilliance. He tried to polish it, but it kept getting duller and duller, until one day, when Olaf reached manhood, it turned into a coarse, dingy stone, nothing like the clear, sparkling diamond the King of the Elves had given him. Then Olaf knew that it was time for him to put away the simple things of childhood. So he carefully tucked the rough old stone away among the warm, glowing memories of his youth. And that was Olaf and the King of the Elves. That, incidentally, is a theme you will see repeated a little bit in the very end, being, all this magical stuff happens. But then you sort of have to, the spell eventually ends, and you need to move on. So a lot of them are kind of about the human condition. as it were, coming of age. Many of them are coming of age stories. There's coming of age stories. There's uh, adventure and journeys. There's a few moral Aesops in there, sort of establishing the moral code of the time period and the location. Give me a moment here, and we'll move on to Harald of Trondheim. Harald of Trondheim. Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived a pale, listless boy named Harald. Every evening, as the light of the moon streamed like liquid gold over the horizon, Harald was filled with a strange happiness. Stealing out of the house, he would climb up on the roof, and as the silvery light silently flooded the sea, the fjords, the forests, and the distant glaciers with brightness, he would sing out a hymn of praise to the moon. One evening, having watched Harold slip out of the house as usual, his mother turned to Halvor, his father, and said, "I am worried about our son. Every night when the moon rises he runs outside to sing to it. What is the meaning of such strange behavior?"
"What does it mean?" Halvor retorted irritably. "I'll tell you what I make of his strange behavior. You baby him too much, saying that he is too small and delicate to work. Thanks to you, he's a namby-pamby idler. What else do you expect him to do but sing to the moon?"
Harold's mother lowered her eyes and was silent for a moment. Much as it pained her to admit it, she felt in her heart that her husband was right. It was true. Harold never helped around the house. It wouldn't be so bad if he went out to play like other boys, but all he ever seemed to do was mope around the house, talking to the sparks from the logs when they flew out of the fireplace, or else singing to the moon. Stung by her husband's rebuke, and irked by the sound of the boy's singing, which was floating down through the rafters into the house, Harold's mother jumped up suddenly and ran out the door. "Harold!" she yelled, "stop that singing and come down from the roof at once. Your father and I have had enough of your nonsense." Immediately the singing stopped, and Harold meekly got down from the roof. But his mother would not be calmed. Soundly boxing his ears, she flung him a pail. "Go to the well and get some water," she ordered him. "At least you'll be good for something." So saying, she turned and went back into the house, slamming the door behind her. Harold felt crushed. Glumly he picked up the pail and set out for the well, which was a good distance from their little house. It was a lonely place at night, but Harold did not mind, since he had the moon for company. Picking his way along the narrow path, he sadly blew a kiss to his friend the moon, whose pale light flooded the starless sky, casting heavy shadows everywhere. As he approached the well, he noticed a strange figure sitting there as though he were waiting for someone. It was a man wearing a large black cloak. Beneath its hood, his face was skull white, and his green eyes flashed in the dark. Harold thought his heart would burst in his throat. "Who are you?" the frightened boy stammered. The stranger did not reply immediately, but just stared at Harold for what seemed to the boy to be a terribly long time. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Scandalin, and I am a wandering poet.
I heard you singing to the moon earlier this evening, and I liked your song very much. He paused and looked at Harald intently. You are not afraid of me, are you? Harald shook his head silently. The stranger's soft, musical voice had made him forget his fear. Do you like the moon? Asked Escatolon. The moon shining on the boy's face made him look like a delicate creature of night. Oh, yes! Exclaimed Harald, finding his voice at last as he lowered his pail into the well. Then look, said the stranger, pointing into the well. Peering down cautiously into the dark depths, Harald saw the bright reflection of the moon's shining disk in the deep, black waters. As he stared at it, full of wonder, he heard the poet's voice hiss softly in his ear. If you would like to touch the moon, all you have to do is get down into the well. In a flash, his fear of the stranger came back. He felt a cold shiver as the ghostly figure bent over him. The rope slid out of his hands, and the pail splashed down into the water below. Instantly he drew back from the well. But the water in the well is deep and cold, he said defiantly, keeping his eyes on the stranger. So you are afraid after all, Escatolon taunted with a nasty sneer. You can't really like the moon as much as you pretend. If you did, you would jump into the well at once and touch the moon. Harald had slowly moved away from the well. How can I believe you, Mr. Escatolon? He cried. The moon is in the sky, and it is only its reflection that I see in the water. If I jump into the well, I will surely drown. I thought you were a brave, smart little boy, Escatolon hissed, moving closer to Harald. But now I see that you are very stupid and have no imagination whatsoever. His green eyes flashed, sending a shaft of fear through Harald. Suddenly he pounced on Harald, and grabbing the boy's shoulders with his icy fingers, began pushing him towards the well. Screaming and kicking and biting, Harald tried with all his might to get loose. Finally, he got a good hold on the stranger's cloak and began to pull and twist it frantically, hoping perhaps to choke him. In a minute now, the stranger would have his way, and Harald would be in the well. With a final, desperate effort, Harald clutched the twisted cloak and yanked, kicking and screaming. The cloak tore, and Harald rolled into the bushes, free. Looking up, he saw a terrible sight. The man had not one, but 3 heads. The first one was glowing white, and the other 2 were as black as coal. It was a troll, a monstrous creation of the secret forces of night. Harald thought he would surely die of fright, but terrified as he was, he scrambled to his feet and began running like the north wind towards home. Snatching the cloak from the ground where Harald had fallen, the monster was instantly running after Harald, his black cloak streaming behind him. Suddenly Harald stumbled and fell flat on his face. In a flash, the monster pounced on him, hissing furiously. I've caught you! I've caught you at last! Harald was too frightened to move. He was completely out of breath, and the troll lying on top of him felt as heavy as a millstone. Quickly, Harald came to his senses and began groping around desperately in the grass and screaming for help. Suddenly, a few inches from his face, he saw something sparkling in the grass. It was the blade of the old scythe he had stumbled on in his flight from the troll. The boy said a silent prayer to the goddess of night. Instantly, a dazzling white light shot out from the blade, blinding the troll. With a blood-curdling yell, the troll clasped his hands to his eyes, and beside himself with pain rolled off Harald. Harold leaped up at once, grabbing the scythe with both hands. With a terrible slash, he lowered the gleaming white scythe on the dazed monster, and in a single stroke the three hideous heads rolled into the grass. Harold dropped the scythe, without daring to look back, dashed for home, screaming like a madman. Pale and trembling, he burst into the kitchen like a gust of wind. Falling into his astonished mother's arms, still shivering with fear, he cried out over and over, "I killed him! I killed him! I killed the Troll!"
Ah, poor boy must have finally taken leave of his senses,
Halvor exclaimed with a worried expression on his face.
He killed a troll? How could he kill a troll when he can't even bring himself to kill a chicken for supper? This is surely just another one of his wild dreams.
Suddenly, Harald's mother, who was stroking his hair, trying to comfort him, screamed in terror. Her hand was smeared with blood. "Look, Halvor!" she cried out, shuddering all over. "Harald is all covered with blood!" She looked hard for a wound on Harald, but there was none. "There is not a scratch on him," she whispered hoarsely to Halvor. "He must be telling the truth." When Harald's father saw the large blood stain on the frightened boy's shirt, he quickly ran out of the house to the woods. There, in the moonlight, halfway to the well, he found the dark figure of a troll lying in the grass, half circled by the three heads. So frightened was Harald's father that he just stood frozen in his tracks. Then, after a moment, he fled for home, screaming,
It's true! It's true! Harold killed a troll! Our boy really killed a troll!
Harald's mother was putting the boy to bed. When she heard this, her arms went numb with horror, and, overwhelmed, she dropped him. But Harald's father rushed over and lifted him up. Taking him outside, he raised Harald over his head and shouted to the moon,
You have protected my son who sang to you every night. I thank you and dedicate my Harold to you. Make him always strong and wise.
He led Harald back into the house, and, sitting down with him in a large chair near the warm fire, he put his arms around the boy.
Until now, Harold, he said gently, I always thought you were a lazy, good-for-nothing idler. But what you have done this night is worthy of the sons of Thor. I am proud of you, and tomorrow all the land shall know of your brave deed.
Then he poured himself a large glass of brew, and said,
I drink to your health and courage, my son.
While Harald and his father were talking, his mother, who was a very practical woman, came over to them and asked, "Harald, what did you do with the pail?" "I left it at the bottom of the well," Harald replied sleepily. The next morning, everyone in the village, from old men with canes to young babes in arms, all rushed to the forest to see with their own eyes the dead troll. Even in death he was a grisly sight which they would long remember. On seeing the troll's three heads lying in the blood-stained grass, everyone shrieked with horror. It was impossible to praise Harald's bravery enough, and he was so small for his age. This was indeed an heroic act, and one which would be remembered and spoken of for generations to come. Finally,
With one mind, everyone turned towards Harald's house to praise him and to congratulate his proud parents. Harald's mother brought out salted herring for the villagers, and his father drew large draughts of beer, inviting everyone to eat and drink, as this was a day for rejoicing. Clearing his... Oh, geez, one sec. Sorry about that. Clearing his throat importantly, and giving his little moustache a twirl, the mayor of the village made a little speech. Then he ordered the troll's body thrown into the sea, so that it would be forgotten forever. 6 of the strongest men wrapped the monster and his 3 terrible heads in a rough cloth and dragged it to the top of a cliff, the villagers following. With a great heave, they threw the troll's body off the cliff. Falling into the sea with a tremendous splash, it disappeared forever in the deep, dark waters of the fjord. The news of Harald's bravery spread swiftly across the countryside, until at last it reached the distant capital of the kingdom. For days and days the palace was buzzing with talk about Harald. Finally, King Gunnar determined to meet the boy who all by himself had killed a troll. And so a court messenger was sent to summon the boy and his family to the palace. All the people in Harald's small village were tremendously excited when they heard the news, for no one from the village had ever gone to the capital before. When the great day came, everyone from the surrounding countryside gathered to see Harald and his family wearing their finest clothes. With their best goat drawing their little cart, they set off for the palace of the king. They journeyed for many days, never lacking for hospitality, as everyone considered it the highest privilege to lodge the hero. At last they drew near to Skallagrim, the hill on which the royal palace had long ago been built. Perched high upon the hill, the palace was clearly visible for miles around. It was an enormous building of grey stone and wood. Harald and his family had never in all their lives seen anything so big, and as they drew nearer, it seemed to grow even bigger. The guards at the great oak door of the palace bade them enter, and a page led them into a magnificent hall with 2 golden thrones, one for the king and the other for his queen. Soldiers in red and beautifully clothed courtiers were already assembled in the great hall, waiting for the hero who had killed a troll. As Harald entered with his parents, everyone turned to stare.
Is this skinny blond boy the hero who killed a troll?
Harald heard a lady laugh as he passed. Another replied,
It does seem impossible.
Harald felt his ears burn. Just at that moment, the king and queen entered, wearing their jeweled crowns and magnificent robes. "Come here, Harald," commanded King Gunnar as he took his place on the throne. Stumbling in embarrassment, Harald approached the throne. King Gunnar looked at him kindly and said gently, "They tell me that you killed a troll all by yourself. How did you do it?" At once the boy felt his shyness fade, and he told of what had happened in the moonlight with such grace and simplicity that everyone was touched. When he had finished, the king spoke. "You are indeed a very intelligent and brave boy. Killing trolls is work usually reserved for my strongest and bravest warriors. It is fitting that the court poet compose a poem about your adventure."
Then, turning to the queen, he asked,
"By the way, where is Ascadalin?"
"Ascadalin has been on a trip out of town for over 2 weeks. I can't imagine why he hasn't returned before now," the queen replied. When Harald heard this, he felt the blood drain from his head and his limbs become numb.
"Why, what is the matter?"
The king asked in consternation. "Ascadalin is the name of the troll I killed," the boy stammered. He ran over to his parents, trembling. There was a great commotion. Everyone spoke at once. Someone shouted, and someone else waved his fist at Harald. The king stood up in anger.
"What does this mean?" he exclaimed. "Would you harm the boy just because he killed a troll who happened to be named Ascadalin?"
Suddenly, everyone's attention was riveted on a door which had just opened at the far end of the hall. "It is Ascadalin!" everyone murmured in surprise. Harald gasped with horror. It was the stranger, the troll he had killed, come back to life. The same cloak, the same dead white face, the same flashing green eyes. Petrified, Harald helplessly hid his face in his mother's skirt. Ascadalin strode over to the king, glaring at him with his terrible glowing eyes. The queen gasped in fright. The courtiers were breathless.
"I am not Ascadalin, your poet!" he cried. "Ascadalin was my brother, and I want revenge for his death."
Turning to Harald, he tore off his cloak. The court gasped with horror. He had 3 heads, one dead white, 2 coal black. He was a troll. Planting himself in the middle of the hall with his 6 eyes flashing, he began swinging his sword at the terrified courtiers.
"Save us, Harald! Save us if you can!"
The king yelled from the throne. The courtiers had all drawn back in terror to the corners of the room, leaving Harald alone to face the troll. Desperately looking around for a weapon, he spied a huge sword with a golden hilt hanging on the wall near the throne. As he dashed over to seize it, the troll roared,
"Don't touch that sword, you little good-for-nothing! It belonged to Eric the Great. Common hands may never defile it."
The boy paused, uncertain what to do. Instantly, with a blood-curdling screech, the troll lunged for Harald. At the same time, the boy flung himself on the floor, escaping the monster's claw-like grasp. Quick as a flash, he sprang up from the opposite direction, ready for battle. There was a chair close by, and Harald took cover as the troll, brandishing his sword, charged at Harald once more. Back and forth the steel blades slashed, but Harald, dodging swiftly, kept the chair between them. Sparks flew every time the sword struck the stone floor. Glancing by chance at the window behind the troll, Harald noticed a pale light rising on the horizon. It was the moon. He addressed a quick, silent prayer to his friend, and immediately felt tremendous strength flowing in his veins.
"All right, troll!" he cried in a great voice. "Now we shall see who shall win."
So powerful was Harald's voice that the king, the courtiers, and even the troll were stunned for a moment. Then again the 3-headed troll came for Harald, shrieking like a wild hyena.
Seizing the heavy chair, the boy hurled it straight at him, striking the troll full across his blazing eyes. The room was filled with the inhuman cries of the wounded monster, as, momentarily blinded, he charged madly about the room, slashing wildly with his sword. Shrinking into the corners, the crowd cried out in helpless terror. At that moment, the moon rose, flooding the room with a stream of silver light. Harald let out a loud cry, "Moon! Moon!" and ran to Eric's sword on the wall. Taking it down swiftly with both hands, Harald began swinging it as though it were a twig rather than a sword renowned for its size and weight. Frothing at all three mouths, the troll ran behind the heavy curtains at a window. "Torches! Torches!" the king called. "I want to see the finish of this heroic fight." At once a few of the bravest pages took down torches from the walls, as, amid all the yelling, Harald ran to the window. He struck 2 blows at the curtain. The pale moonlight again flooded the room, and Harald taunted the troll in a voice that carried out to all corners of the room. "Come out, troll! The moon is watching you!" The fiend leapt out from behind the curtains, his sword raised to strike, and in such a blind rage that he didn't see Eric's sword pointing straight at him. Lunging toward Harald, he was pierced clear through, and, with the wild cry of a rabid dog, he keeled to the ground, quite dead. Then Harald took the troll's own sword from his horny hands and cut off his 3 heads with a single sweeping stroke. The crowd began to sob in an agony of relief. Numerous servants appeared, bearing torches. And there, in the light of the torches and the moonlight, everyone saw the 3 hideous heads of the troll, lying on the blood-soaked floor. The courtiers stood very still, like statues, as though they were under an evil spell. Now that the fight was over, Harald himself was stunned. The contrast between the troll's huge body and the small, delicate boy was too great. The queen began to weep silently. The king was the first to speak. "Harald! Harald!" he cried in a low voice filled with emotion. "You are the greatest of my subjects, the bravest of my warriors. You, a little boy, have saved us all from this terrible monster." Then everyone began to cheer and to applaud the child. Lifting Harald high on their shoulders, the crowd carried him all around the great hall in triumph as Halvor and his wife, weeping for joy, embraced each other thankfully. The queen, seeing the pale little boy still surrounded by the admiring crowd of courtiers, intervened, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, I pray you, let Harald's mother and father embrace their gallant son." The crowd formed a wide circle as, gently, Harald was lowered to the ground. Still panting a little from the struggle, he ran at once to his parents' arms. Then King Gunnar clapped his hands and said, "Today is a holiday. Let my servants bring food and drink for all. But first, bring me a large mug of beer so that Harald may drink." When it was brought, the king held up a mug, saying, "Drink, Harald, to your health and to your courage." "Those are the words my father spoke to me after I had killed a Scandalin at the well," Harald remarked with wonder. "Then your father must be a very wise man," said King Gunnar, smiling kindly. And so everyone drank and applauded Harald's valor. Then Clapping his hands, the king ordered everyone to leave the great hall, that he might be alone with Harald. Together the king and the little boy went over to look once more at the fiend. Staring at the dead troll, the boy said to King Gunnar, "He really is just like the other one. He should be thrown into the fjord to keep his brother company." And so King Gunnar ordered the troll's body wrapped in a rough cloth with its 3 horrid heads. Then it was hurled from the top of the cliff. It fell amid the screeching seagulls, and with a splash sank into the icy green waters of the fjord, which was embroidered by the moonlight with delicate strands of silver. For the next day King Gunnar ordered a great celebration. He wished to dub Harald a knight. From before dawn the palace was a beehive of activity. The cooks were busy cooking all manner of fish and fowl, and the chief pastry maker was creating a pie especially for the great occasion. The great palace was filled with all the people from Harald's village, and naturally all the courtiers were there too. Jugglers were summoned to entertain the people, and all morning long the court tailors were busy with Harald. When at last Harald entered the great hall, everyone gasped with amazement. He looked like a little prince. No longer was he clad in the peasant's cloth, but instead he was wearing a suit of fine stuff embroidered all over with gold. His boots of soft reindeer skin were embossed and stitched in gold. On his head he wore a sealskin cap adorned with feathers. He was so handsome that his mother almost fainted with pride when she saw him. When the king descended from the throne to take Harald's hands, everyone was even more surprised, for this was a consideration given only to foreign kings. Harald was told to kneel. Then a page came forth, bearing Eric the Great's sword upon a shield. King Gunnar took the great sword and placed it upon the boy's head, saying, "Harald, I dub you Knight of the Realm. Henceforth you shall be called Harald of Trondheim, and you will have the right to transmit this name to your sons. Such is my will." Then, bending over, he kissed Harald on both cheeks. In Harald's hands he placed the sword of Eric the Great, saying gravely, "This is the sword of my ancestor. I give it to you because you used it to defend your king. Always be courageous, and above all, never lose faith in powers greater than yourself. May the moon befriend you all the days of your life." Then King Gunnar returned to his throne and signaled for the celebration to begin, a celebration that was to be remembered by all. Harald and his parents remained at court, and as time went on, Harald proved that he was not only brave, but intelligent as well. He became a fine writer and wrote many beautiful poems about the deeds of his people and the glory of his country. And that was the tale of Harald of Trondheim. So with that, you can clearly see, sort of a Beowulfian aspect there. Um, very, very much a coming-of-age tale of bravery and heroism. Also, do not mess with Harold on a moonlit night, looking like a troll, because that small boy will cut your heads off. If you're a troll, Harold's gonna mess your day up. He'll kill you. He'll kill you. If you're not a troll, though, you're fine. Alrighty, next up is Nor's Journey. I don't know how long this one is. We should be fine. Not very. And then the Song of Egil, which I also hope to read, time permitting. Well, that one is longish, so time may not permit. I'll find a way. It's also the tale of Eric the Red. I don't know if Eric the Red is the same as Eric the Great from the previous story. But we will go with Nor's Journey for now, um, and work our way along and see how much time we have at the end of that. Alrighty, give me one sec to get a little more water here. Nor's Journey. Many hundreds of years ago, the land we now call Europe was invaded by fierce, warlike tribes from Asia. One of them, a bold, adventurous horde, moved from place to place in search of a land where they could live in peace and happiness. They were led by a great chief named Thor, a brave and clever man who had won many victories in battle. Thor knew that because of his courage and wisdom, his people thought of him as a mighty hero and would follow him anywhere. So he led them across the great plains of Europe to what today is called the North Sea. After a long journey along the shores of the shining, sunlit sea, they came to a beautiful land of fresh, green plains, stretching out as far as the eye could see. Lakes of dazzling blue water shone like shimmering mirrors in the golden sunlight, and the trees of the tall, thick forests seemed to sweep the sky. After all their wanderings and hardships, it seemed to Thor and his people that they had found a garden of paradise. Calling the whole tribe around him, Thor climbed up on a small, shining rock and said, "My people, I take possession of this land in the name of Sveg, the god of storms who has guided and protected us. We will call it Sveg Ya, or the land of Sveg." In those days, the dark forests of Svegia, or Sweden as we call it today, were bathed in the golden sunlight during the summer. Flowers of all colors dotted the bright green fields, and singing streams of clear water ran bubbling to the sea. But during the long winters, the whole countryside was wrapped in darkness, except for a blaze of brightness now and then from the beautiful northern lights. On one side of Sweden was a tall chain of mountains. Their slopes were covered with dense black forests, and summer and winter their peaks were crowned with snow. So dark and frightening were they that Thor and his people thought that they must be the home of powerful, cruel gods. No one dared to go near them. Yet every evening at sundown, as Thor stood outside his tent watching the huge black shadows of the mountains slowly creep over the countryside, while millions of stars twinkled like jewels in the velvet blue sky, he wondered what the other side of the sacred mountains was like. He longed to go there with gifts for the gods, so that they would not unleash their fury on him and his people, but he was too old and tired from his many battles and the long trek across the plains of Europe. One day he sent for Nor and Gor, his two sons, and Goa, his lovely daughter. "My children," he said, "if we do not pay our respects to the gods on the mountain, I fear they will be angry. but I am too old and sick for such a long trip, so tomorrow the three of you must go in my place with offerings for the gods."
Young and full of adventure, Thor's children were thrilled at the idea of going to the sacred mountains all alone. They set out early the next morning, Nor with fire, Gor with water, and Goa with a snow-white elk. On arriving at the foot of the mountains, they decided to separate. Nor and Gor went off in different directions, and Goa stayed behind to choose her own path. Once her brothers had left, Goa looked around, enchanted by the strange, beautiful place. There was the sweet smell of flowers everywhere, chirping birds fluttering in and out amongst the trees, and crystal clear waterfalls rushing down to the sea from the snow-capped mountains filled the air with soft, delicate music. Goa led the white elk up a gentle slope, accompanied by countless birds singing and twittering all around her, until she came to a little plain where the mountains seemed even more lovely and the flowers more radiant. It was like a fairyland glowing with light and color. Goa's heart swelled with delight as she ran here and there, picking flowers and admiring birds with bright, shimmering feathers darting among the plants. She had just finished gathering a small handful of dainty blue forget-me-nots when suddenly she noticed a tall, dark-haired young man a short distance away. She hadn't heard him come up, and was frightened to find him standing there staring at her. "Who are you?" she stammered timidly. "I am Rolfo, lord of all the lands beyond the mountains," answered the young man. "And who are you?" "My name is Goa. My father is Thor, lord of Svegya," replied the girl, surprised that she and the stranger spoke the same language. She didn't know that many years before her father had led his people to the North Sea. Another tribe had already settled in the lands beyond the mountains. All was silent for a while, as the two young people just stood there staring at each other. Goa was a little frightened, and her heart was beating wildly. Suddenly, without a word, Rolfo seized the girl around the waist, swung her up on his horse, and rode off with her over the mountains to the land which none of Thor's people had ever dared visit, because they believed it to be the home of the gods. At sundown, Nor and Gor went back to the foot of the mountains, where they were supposed to meet Goa. For hours and hours they looked for her, but not a trace of her was to be found. At nightfall, when they saw the white elk that Goa had brought wandering around alone, they knew that something had happened to their sister, and they rushed home to tell their father. When Thor heard that his only daughter was missing, he was heartbroken. For a moment he stood silent and motionless, gazing into the blackness of night. Then, with a sudden burst of anger, he ordered his two sons to go back at once and to look for their sister, and not to return without her. Gor went to the edge of the sea, which the people of Svegya called the Swan Road. He bought a large, sturdy dragon ship, and with a band of brave men set out to sail around the world in search of Goa. Nor decided to take a small group of warriors and look for her in the mysterious lands beyond the mountains, which none of his people had ever seen. They went up a gentle slope, past the very place where Goa had met the stranger. Brilliant flowers were bursting with color everywhere along the way, and the air was filled with the lively sounds of chirping birds. But soon the trail became steeper, and the soft breeze turned into a cold, biting wind. Walking in single file, Nor and his men climbed higher and higher into the frightening silence of eternal snow. When they finally arrived at the top of the mountain, they eagerly rushed to look down at the unknown land below, and an amazing sight met their eyes. In the distance, across green, sun-bathed meadows,
They saw the dazzling blue waters of the sea piercing the coast in hundreds of places. Mountains with tall, leafy trees as green as jade towered to the sky. Right below them, herds of reindeer roamed here and there, around lakes gleaming like mirrors, and across white, frothy streams, sparkling and flashing in the sun. This truly is the land of the gods, Nor exclaimed. Then, after his men had rested, he gave the order to start down the mountain to the unknown valley. For days and days they wound their way through the dense woods and bushes without meeting a soul. But there was no lack of excitement. The forest was teeming with herds of reindeer, elk, and enormous animals which Nor and his men had never seen before. Wild buffalo, bison, and huge brown bears. Hunting the animals for food was a thrilling adventure for these men who loved action. One day, when they were chasing a herd of reindeer, Nor and his men were suddenly attacked by a pack of large, ferocious wolves. Blood-chilling screams and snarls filled the air as the beasts savagely tore into the men. In a long and terrible battle, Nor and his companions bravely tried to fight them off. Finally, when the trees and ground were covered with blood and several wolves had been killed, the howling animals ran away. But just when Nor and his men thought they were out of danger, the ferocious leader of the wolf pack came rushing towards Nor, his big teeth flashing like daggers. Nor tried to dodge his attacker, but he tripped and fell, dragging his heavy shield, his lance, and the snarling wild beast with him in a frantic death struggle. The wolf's long, pointed teeth were getting closer and closer to Nor's throat, and the rest of the pack had already descended on the men, when suddenly a long arrow whizzed through the air. Struck in its side, the screaming wolf fell to the ground. Immediately a shower of arrows came hissing through the air and fell on the other wolves, killing many and frightening the others away. As the last wolf disappeared among the trees, Nor and his men looked around to see who had come to their rescue. Not far away, they saw a group of tall, bold-looking warriors. At the head of them was a tall man. A tall young man. Let's not do that. At the head of them was a tall young man of noble bearing, who seemed to be their leader. Nor went over to the warrior, and in sign language tried to thank him for rescuing him and his men. To Nor's great surprise, the stranger answered in a language which he could understand. Trembling with excitement, Nor told the stranger that he had led his men across the mountains in search of his sister. When Nor finished speaking, the stranger said that he was Rolfo, the lord of these lands that had been conquered by his father many years before. He invited Nor and his men to his palace, where they could rest from their long journey. It was almost sundown when they reached the palace. Rolfo immediately ordered food and drink for his guests. While they were eating, Nor told his host the story of Goa's disappearance, and as Rolfo listened to Nor describe his sister's charm and beauty, he realized that she was the girl he had kidnapped on the other side of the mountain. Summoning his servants, he commanded them to prepare a splendid feast. Then he sent for Goa. It would be impossible to describe how surprised Nor was to see his sister enter the great hall, dressed in fine, rich clothes, and covered with shining jewels. Nor, here is your sister. She is now the queen of my people, Rolfo said, taking her hand. Weeping for joy, Nor and Goa fell into each other's arms. A few minutes later, Goa told her brother how happy she was to be Rolfo's wife. Nor was overjoyed to find her well and happy. A moment later, heralds rushed from the palace with orders from Rolfo to proclaim a holiday in honor of Nor and Goa's reunion, and to announce that their father was the king of a friendly people. For several days afterwards, Nor and his men remained in Rolfo's palace, eating and drinking in great cheer. Then, amid great pomp and fanfare, and loaded with gifts, they set out for home, escorted part of the way by Rolfo and his warriors. Nor and his companions went up the steep mountains, and down again, and before long arrived safely within sight of Svegja. Loud cheers and shouts of joy greeted them as they entered Thor's camp, laden with gifts and many kinds of game no one in Svegja had seen before. During the long winter evenings that followed, Thor and his whole tribe crowded into Nor's tent to hear the wonderful stories of his journey to the lands beyond the mountains. And every evening Thor praised his son for having discovered a rich, new land of friendly neighbors. In time, it became a custom among Thor's people to call the new land Norveg, or the land of Nor's journey. Today, this country is called Norway. And do you remember Nor's brother Gore, who started out to sail around the search? Wow, who started. And do you remember Nor's brother Gore, who started out to sail around the world in search of Goa? Well, after a long sea voyage, he came to a cluster of islands known to sea-going men as Faroe, or group of sheep, because from a distance they look like a flock of woolly white sheep. The people of Faroe were so amazed to see Gore's mighty dragon ship approach their islands, with its bright sails flying in the breeze, that they thought the gods must have sent them a king. So they proclaimed Gore Viking, or foreign king. And that is how the brave seagoing people called Vikings got their name. And that was Nor's journey. As you're hearing or seeing stuff like this, you can clearly see how something like the Conan the Barbarian stories, grew from this sort of a sword and, take a lot of hints from this sort of a sword and sorcery, um, adventurous idea. Tales of great adventure. Heck, not just that, obviously. Tons of other things take their hints from stuff like this. So it's kind of nice to read. Here's some formative tales that we sort of base a lot of our other tales on, whether we know it or not. Next up is the Song of Egil. Which may have to be the last one I do for today. The Song of Egil. Long, long ago, there was a great warrior and navigator named Egil, who lived in Norway with his wife and 3 children. His sons were named Bodvar and Gunnar, and his daughter Torgerd. Now Egil had many faithful followers in Norway, but he was not happy there because jealous enemies would not let him live in peace. So early one morning, with Bodvar and a few companions, he set sail across the sea in search of a new land. A cold, biting wind caught their sails as soon as the boat swung away from the shore, and the dark, heavy clouds looked so cold they seemed ready to break into showers of icicles. For days and days they rode the sea, tossed and pounded by huge waves and driven by great blasts of freezing wind. One morning, during a raging storm, Egil was standing at the prow of his ship, eagerly watching for sign of land. Suddenly, above the howling wind, he shouted, "Danger ahead! Danger ahead!" Gigantic icebergs were floating in the waters a short distance away, like huge white monsters guarding a forbidden shore. Egil kept watching the great columns of ice, and, here and there, caught a glimpse of a strange, beautiful coast beyond. "To your oars, men!" he called out. "Row past the ice mountains and find a place to land." Slowly, slowly, the men rowed. Finally they steered the ships, between the high, jagged walls of ice, to a fjord, and found a place to drop anchor. When they set foot on land, Egil and his men stood and gazed about in wonder. Before them lay broad stretches of bright green grass, teeming with wild reindeer. The air was cool and crisp, and in the distance huge snow-capped mountains reached up to the clear blue sky. "We have found a new world!" Egil exclaimed. "Here we can live in peace, far from our enemies." Then he looked back at the sea and added, "Since our new home is surrounded by an army of icebergs, let us call it Iceland." The men quickly took their supplies off the boats. Then, led by Egil, they set out to explore the new land and chose a place for their homes. All day long they traveled over wide, grassy plains and up steep mountains until at last they came to a deep valley where beautiful birch trees and gaily colored flowers grew. "Here is the place for our homes!" Egil shouted. Almost at once the men began putting up their tents. A great fence of pointed logs was erected around the camp, and they named the place Hanafli Ilan. Later, when Egil proclaimed himself the king of Iceland, the name was changed to Egil's City. At last came the day for Bodvar to return to Norway for his mother and the rest of their people. "Beware of our enemies," Egil warned his son. "They will ask many questions about our new land. Unless you tell them where we are, they may even refuse to let our people leave. But you must not breathe a word about Iceland to the hostile Norwegians. They will only come here and pick new fights with us. If you succeed in bringing our people back, fly a white sail on your return. But if our enemies will not let them leave, spread a black sail, and we will know that our loved ones are lost forever." At dawn the next day, Bodvar and a few warriors set out on the dangerous trip back to Norway. Egil and all his men went to the shore to see them off and wish them a successful journey. Bodvar embraced his father, promising to remember everything that he had told him. Then he and his men boarded their ship and sailed swiftly out of sight over the wind-swept sea. Several weeks passed. Egil and his men had almost given up hope of ever seeing their loved ones again, when one evening a lookout saw the mighty dragon ship approaching, with its white sails flapping in the wind. Instantly he sounded the alarm, and Egil and his men came running to the shore. Wildly waving and calling to the boat, they filled the air with cries of joy and excitement. Suddenly a great hush fell over them. One of the sails on Bodvar's ship was black. Now there was a heavy, waiting stillness in the air, as all eyes stared at the gloomy sail moving swiftly to the shore. "Father! Father! Bodvar is dead! Bodvar is dead!" they heard a young voice cry, as the ships drew nearer. Holding on to the dragon head at the prow of his brother's ship, was Gunnar, his hair flying in the breeze, and tears streaming down his cheeks. Men wearing helmets with towering horns brought Bodvar's body off the boat and laid it on the shore among the weeds and tall grasses. With a great cry, Egil knelt beside his son and grew as pale and silent as a statue. His eyes wide with horror, he stared at Bodvar without shedding a tear, as though his son would soon awaken from a deep sleep. Soon the weighty silence was broken by loud sobbing and wailing, and their children and whoops. Soon the weighty silence was broken by loud sobbing and wailing, and raising his eyes, he saw his wife Asgerd and their children. Weeping bitterly, he fell into their arms, and they mourned their great loss together. Gradually the surrounding darkness was illumined by a growing circle of light, as hundreds of people with torches approached Bodvar's body, singing a somber funeral chant. And, mixed with the clamorous cries of Egil and his family, their thunderous voices filled the blackness of night like a gathering storm. When Bodvar was at last buried, Gunnar told his father what had happened. "Like an evil omen," he began sadly, "a violent storm was raging in Norway on the night Bodvar arrived." Then, in a tearful voice, Gunnar told of how a powerful chieftain named Thorsvel had held Egil's family for ransom, of how Orhan, the king of Trondfjord, had paid the ransom so that Bodvar could take his family and the rest of the people away. But as the ship was ready to leave, Thorsvel, who wanted to marry Egil's daughter, Thorgerd, rowed up and called out from the shore, "Bodvar, son of Egil, tell me where you are taking your sister, so that one day I can find her and make her my wife." "I promised my father that I would say nothing about our new home," Bodvar yelled back. Instantly Thorsvel fitted his bow with a long arrow. "Then let this be my greeting to your father," he screamed as the arrow whizzed through the air towards the ship. The arrow struck Bodvar in the chest, killing him instantly. Shrieks of horror rose from his family and from everyone on the ship. On the shore, Thorsvel was preparing to take cover in the mountains. Just as he was turning around, a shower of arrows fell on him, and he toppled down the sides of the cliff, dragging his horse with him into the roaring sea below. "Then we set our course for Iceland," concluded Gunnar, still weeping. "And among the white sails announcing the safe arrival of my mother and sister, I raised a black sail in mourning for my beloved brother." "Odin, god of storms!" Egil shouted, as he stood up and raised his arms to the heavens. "Calm the fury in my heart! Give me the wisdom to forget this horrible crime, and to remember my beloved Bodvar without hate for his assassin!" With a loud voice, the crowd repeated Egil's prayer. And at dawn, when a great pyramid of stone had been erected over Bodvar's grave, Egil and his followers went back to their homes in Hanafli Ilan. As time passed, Egil and his people became more and more settled in their new home. A great palace of wood and stone was built and furnished with warm rugs of reindeer and buffalo skins, sturdy tables, long benches, and a magnificent high seat for Egil. Before long, smaller houses sprang up around the palace. Soon every family had a home, and it was time to think of storing food and wood for the hard winter. Egir, Egil said one day to an adventurous young warrior, if we keep killing all the game around Hanafli Ilan, soon there will be none left. There must be good hunting in places we have not yet explored in Iceland. Why don't you go and see what we can find? What? Oh my gosh. Why am I having such a hard time? Why don't you go and see what you can find? Egir was thrilled at the idea. He immediately set out with several companions for the west of Iceland. For months and months they explored and hunted farther and farther from Hanafli Ilan than they had ever gone before. When they returned there was great rejoicing, and Egil ordered a splendid feast in their honor, for Egir and his companions had brought back many kinds of game, seal skins, reindeer skins, and a pack of wild dogs they had trained to pull sleds. So pleased was Egil with the young warrior's success that he readily consented when Egir asked for Thorgerd's hand in marriage. Egir and Thorgerd were married with great splendor, and afterward Egir said to his bride's father, "Great king, with your permission I would like to take Thorgerd to live with me in a small city I have built on the western coast." So, with Egil's blessing, the young couple went to their new home, accompanied by all Egir's companions. "My dear queen, our family has grown smaller," said Egil a few days later. Whoops, wrong name. "My dear queen, our family has grown smaller," said Egil a few days later. "Only Gunnar, the last of our sons, is still with us." "Yes, I know," said Asgerd with a sigh. "Every evening I pray to Thor and Odin to protect our son. He is so young and reckless that I am afraid that something terrible might happen to him." All young boys are brave and full of adventure. That is why we teach them heroism when they are young. If Gunnar wants to be a bold, fearless youth, so much the better," answered Egil. Asgerd bowed her head and was very quiet. Somehow she was still afraid for her remaining son. One evening, when they were all sitting at the table, Gunnar said, "Father, may I go to the coast tomorrow to visit Bodvar's tomb? I would like to sacrifice a white elk in memory of my brother." "My son, you know I would never forbid you to perform such a worthy deed. But be careful. Many people from Norway come to the coast looking for a chance to avenge Dorsvel's death and take our land. Keep your eyes open, and don't stay any longer than necessary."
Queen Asgerd stared at Egil and Gunnar in silence, and as she looked from one face to the other, her heart swelled with sorrow. Early the next morning, Gunnar and a few companions rode to the sea-shore. At Bodvar's tomb they sacrificed the white elk. Then they lit a huge fire and sang the funeral chant. Just as they finished and were about to scatter the ashes to the wind, a long arrow suddenly whizzed through the air. It struck one of the youths in the chest, killing him instantly. "Quick! Prepare to fight! The Norwegians are here!" shouted Gunnar to his friends. He leaped on his horse. Instantly the air grew thick with arrows, and more of Gunnar's companions fell. Gunnar was thrown from his horse as it bolted and ran away.
Then from behind the rocks swarmed a band of warriors, and a terrible battle began. Gunnar and his men fought bravely and fiercely for hours, but the young men were outnumbered, and no match for the seasoned Norwegian warriors. Finally, badly wounded and weak from the loss of blood, Gunnar himself was killed. And that evening, when the sun set on the blood-soaked beach, not one of the gallant band was alive. As the evening drew on, Egil began to worry about his son's long absence. "Has Gunnar still not come back?" he asked his wife as the evening torches were being lit in the palace. Asgerd sat silently. Asgerd sat quietly looking at her husband a moment. "My king," she began slowly, "I fear we will never see our son again. I have just seen a swarm of black albatrosses pass by, a sign of death and misfortune." Then, hiding her face in her hands, she began to cry.
Why do women always look on the dark side of things?
Egil exclaimed nervously.
Gunnar will come back, I know it.
But despite his brave words, Egil was just as worried as Asgerd, and, to hide it, he ordered servants to bring him beer. When night came, there was still no sign of Gunnar. Beside himself with worry, Egil paced the floor while Asgerd stood in the doorway, holding back her tears as she stared at the starless sky. At dawn, Egil and a small company of men went to look for his son. And when they came to Bodvar's tomb and saw what had happened, they were struck with horror. Egil looked at the young men lying dead all around him and began searching for Gunnar. Suddenly he let out a loud cry which shook the earth. Then he put Gunnar's body on his horse and galloped off to a high, lonely mountain, roaring in the wind.
Thor Odin, give me a great tomb for my son, for with him goes my heart to the home of the gods.
Dawn flooded the sky with its most radiant colors as Egil and his horse scrambled up the mountains with Gunnar's body. Suddenly there was a blinding flash of light. The earth trembled, and, as if by magic, huge rocks opened up to reveal a fantastic cave of crystal stalactites and gold stalagmites. Rushing from the top of the cave was a cascade of water so clear and bright that it lit up the inside like moonlight. Egil rode into the cave and found a large snow-white rock which looked like a bed covered with emerald green moss. He laid Gunnar down on it and knelt down beside him. And when he had no tears left to cry, he rode out of the cave, crying, "May no one ever find the place where my Gunnar sleeps his eternal sleep." Suddenly there was a tremendous roar, and the great rocks closed, sealing the cave forever. When he returned to his palace, Egil said to Asgerd, "Our son has gone on a long journey. We may never see him again." "I knew it," Asgerd said, embracing her husband. "My mother's heart told me." So great was Egil's grief that he shut himself up in his room. He refused all visitors, and would neither eat nor drink. Asgerd tried in vain to reason with him. "Egil!" she cried, standing at the heavy door which her husband had bolted. "Do not inflict another sorrow on our family. Come out! Return to us, I implore you!" But Egil refused to answer. The only sound she heard from his room was Gunnar's name being repeated over and over in a faint, mournful voice. Desperate, and fearing another disaster, Asgerd sent a message to her daughter in the west of Iceland, asking her to come to the palace. Immediately, Thorgerd hastened to Hanafli Ilan. As she approached the palace, the poor girl saw black flags of mourning flying from the roof, and crowds of people glumly filing to the palace grounds. A cold fear gripped her heart, and she ran into the house. Asgerd, with tears streaming down her face, rushed to meet her daughter, exclaiming, "Oh, Thorgerd, a new sorrow has befallen us. For 3 days your father has refused to eat or drink because of his grief for Gunnar." Thorgerd's heart sank when she heard the terrible news, but she had to think of something. "Where is my father now?" she asked. Asgerd pointed to Egil's room. Then, in a low whisper, Thorgerd said, "Let us stand outside the door, mother. Then you ask me why I have come back to Hanafli Ilan, and if I am hungry." They tiptoed to the door, and Asgerd cried out loudly, "Daughter, what brings you to this house of sorrow? You must be hungry after such a long trip." "No, mother," replied Thorgerd, shouting so that Egil would hear her. "I cannot eat when my father is so filled with grief that he wants to starve to death. I came to be at his side and to die with him." Even though he had made up his mind to die, Egil was a little cheered by the sound of his daughter's voice. "Welcome, Thorgerd," he called weakly. "Come in and console your grieving father." Before going in, Thorgerd whispered to her mother, "Send a horseman to collect seaweed. I think I have a way to make father forget his terrible plan." Asgerd sent for the seaweed, and Thorgerd went in to see her father. With his eyes flaming from weeping, he was stretched out on his bed as pale and wan as a ghost. "Father, allow me to stretch out beside you, so that in death we can both be reunited with Bodvar and Gunnar in the kingdom of Odin," said Thorgerd. "You are a good daughter," Egil said, embracing her. "We will make the journey to the realm of silence and darkness together." She lay very still for a moment, almost without breathing. Then Thorgerd called out, "Mother, send me what I asked you for." A servant entered with a copper bowl and placed it on the bed. "What is this?" the king asked, raising himself up weakly. "It is seaweed, father," Thorgerd answered. "It is a powerful drug that I will chew to shorten my time on this sorrowful earth." She took one morsel, then another, and began slowly chewing the seaweed. Egil looked at his daughter out of one eye and decided that he might as well shorten his time too. Soon father and daughter were both munching away like two rabbits. But the seaweed was very bitter, and before long their lips were dry and their mouths were burning as if they were chewing on red-hot peppers. "I would like a little water to cool my throat," Thorgerd said, sitting. Whoops! "I would like a little water to cool my throat," Thorgerd said, sitting up. She went to the next room, where she had told her mother to wait for her with a pitcher of milk. When she came back, she drank a little and offered some to her father. Egil's mouth was so hot from the seaweed that he grabbed the pitcher and drank it down in one gulp. "Oh, father!" Thorgerd exclaimed as Egil drained the last drop of milk from the pitcher. "We have been betrayed! It was not water but milk that we drank. Now her fast has been broken, and death will be delayed." Egil beat his brow in anger. "Bodvar! Gunnar!" he called. "Our happy reunion has been postponed!" A moment later, said in a quiet, wheedling voice,
While waiting for death, why not write a poem about the adventures of Bodvar and Gunnar? Then all the people can hand down the story of their bravery to the children.
Torgerd's idea pleased Egil. He even managed a faint smile, and sent for the court scribes. And when they were gathered around him, with their stone tablets and styluses, he began dictating the story of Bodvar and Gunnar's heroism. The more he talked, the more excited he became, and the more he felt the dryness in his throat from the seaweed. Ordered more milk, and Egil gulped it down as fast as she gave it to him. Soon the pangs of thirst and hunger were gone, and his cheeks were flushed with color. All evening and all night Egil talked and talked about his sons, and the scribes took down every word. At dawn, when the poem was finished, Egil decided to read it to the people himself. He ordered everything to be made ready in the great hall of the palace, and then turned to his daughter, saying, Torgerd, your wisdom has saved me from a death of my own design. I am grateful to you. Through your love, the will to live and the meaning of my duties as a king and father have been restored to me. May the gods bless and keep you always. All the people, young and old, gathered in the great hall of Egil's palace. And as the king sat in his high seat, reading the poem of war and valor, Asgerd wept for joy. When the poem was finished, all the people applauded their king with great enthusiasm. As time went on, the great tale of Bodvar and Gunnar spread across the Northland, as fathers and mothers retold the saga to their children during the long Scandinavian winters. Many centuries later, the tablets, with Egil's song engraved upon them, were discovered and translated. And that is how we know the story of Bodvar and Gunnar. And that was the Song of Egil. And a mighty song it was. Kind of like ancient therapy, I guess. You could say dealing with loss is something that does in fact feature somewhat prominently in these because it was not a nice time. It was a very hard time, and people died with regularity. So people had to deal with a great deal of loss. Even great and mighty kings of newly discovered lands. Well, newly settled lands anyway. So yeah, that will have to do it for today. I got to scoot. Hopefully people enjoyed. There are still a substantial number of stories in this collection, so you can expect to hear more of these. I was about to say see. It is not a visual medium. It should be, and if I could make it so, I would. Um, I will look to see if I can find a digital version of this. If not, sadness. But if I can, great. But if not, I'll just keep reading them anyway. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. I do try to do this every week. As I intimated earlier, I will not be here for the next 2 weeks. I will not be present. I'm away on a mighty journey of my own. But I will resume after I return. And I shall return with my shield or upon it. So yes, thank you for that. If you're watching this live, congratulations. You're one of the few, the proud and the brave. You are most likely watching this. You're most likely watching this on YouTube, um, recorded, as it were, which is the easiest way to do this. And if so, you can check out my other work, or if you want to catch me live, I do these at noon Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Time, whatever we're at, daily time, Eastern Daily Time, post spring forward, every Friday at noon. Sometimes a bit late, so be patient. Sorry.
Um, you can also check all my other stuff that I've done that's archived right there. It's mostly organized. I have to do a little reorganization, but I'll get around to that before I am gone. So in the next week or so, that should be all organized. And I do other streams throughout the week. I have a Mecha Monday stream where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent, as well as Warframe Wednesdays where I do some Warframe for a couple hours. And then these Free Read Fridays where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. So yeah, thanks again. That's my spiel. Have a good one. Stay safe. Stay sane. Um, Remember that humanity throughout the ages has dealt with loss and dealt with the human condition for millennia now, and the old stories still have something to tell us, even if they are dated because they don't have cell phones and touring apps that can act as therapists, or faster than light travel, or the internet, or you know everything we base our society on. All right, have a good one, folks. Thanks again, and have a great time.